Yeah, there we go. Forward and backward. Hi. Everybody doing all right? Still with us? All right. That was the title of the slide. So here we go. We're going to talk about 3 different frameworks that you can use. This morning we started having a little bit of a introduction about dialogue and encouraging dialogue, and I want to introduce these frameworks as a way of engaging people in a meaningful conversation and dialogue about the nature of the work that you're trying to accomplish with them, that you're trying to help them achieve. So the first idea to have in your head is this notion of a predictable path. That is, that we are walking on a predictable path. We have this expression of, we've seen that movie and we know how it ends. You've all kind of used some version of that. The predictable path is, if nothing changes, we can be pretty certain what the future is going to be like. It's going to look a lot like it did today, and today looks a lot like it did yesterday. So the predictable path. Now, many of you in the room actually try to lead organizations on and communities and individuals on some departure from that predictable path. So how do we forge a bold path? How do we escape the sort of gravitational pull of the status quo and lead and create change? Anybody in the room tried to create change? Yeah, some of you? So help groups create change, drive positive change in the world? Easy, right? Never run into any problems, right? Okay, so what's going on there is that whenever we try to depart from the norm, whenever we try to depart from the predictable path, we start to experience some kind of resistance, some kind of friction. It gets expressed in many different ways, in many different forms. I want to just do a little bit of a exercise with you. This is actually my draft slide deck. So we're missing the exercise, but I don't need prompts for it. So here it goes. I was going to do a pop quiz before I showed this slide that reveals everything to you, right? And makes sense of everything. Here's the pop quiz. I'm going to ask you for an answer to a question. As soon as you have the answer, I want you to stand up. Okay, as soon as it's in your head, I want you to stand up. It's a very complex question, so follow with me. What is 1/2 of 13? What is 1/2 of 13? When you have the answer in your head, stand up. Okay, 1/2 of 13. Some people are still working on it. I can see you're sitting down. All right. If the answer that you have in your head is 6.5 or 6 1/2, sit down. All right. 1. T-H-I-R. Third. T-H-I-R. 3. 3. 13 halves. Okay. Very good. So, and here we go. 7. Okay. Interesting. Rounding up. No? Tell us how.
If you write 13 in the Roman numerals and then you cut it in half, you actually get 7 on the top half.
You actually get 7 on the top half. Now, in fact, if you count all 3 of the ones, you get 8. But I love it because you took the pattern and you bifurcated it. You split it. Your math skills in Roman are sort of suspect, right? That's okay. So what happened is I asked you the question, I put some time pressure on you, and you stood up and you answered the question. The predictable answer to that question is 6.5, is 6 1/2. Why? Any thoughts on why we thought 6 1/2? Arithmetic. We assumed it was a math question. So we made an assumption that it was a math question. We have made a set of synaptic connections in our head, because we've been taught math, that says, bing, 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 I know how to solve math problems. So I asked the question, but I didn't give you any context. What if it was a philosophical question? 6.5 would be the least interesting answer to the philosophical question of what is 1/2 of 13. It would, you might have said, well, why 13? Or what are numbers? Right? It would have been a more interesting thing. So I had somebody give me an answer, which it's sort of what's left after your hungry friend gets the donuts. right? Baker's dozen, 13, 1/2, 6.5 donuts. So it's sort of, what's the context? What's the thing that we're trying to solve? What's going on here on the predictable path is that as we learn things, we create synaptic connections, and a set of neural pathways get established in our brain. Has anybody in the room ever had that experience of going from work to home, driving from work to home, pulling up in your driveway and thinking, I don't really remember driving home? Right? Yeah, I became an autonomous vehicle because, I was distracted. What was going on when you did that? What was going on in your head? Listening to music, getting carried away. You didn't really have to think about, how do I get home? Because, again, the synaptic connections are made, so many synaptic connections that you have a neural pathway in your head that can take you home without thinking about it. So that's great. How many people in the room? Let's do this. We'll do a stand-up just because everybody needs a little more stretching. If you brushed your teeth this morning, stand up. All right, I didn't get half of you to stand up. That's good. I'm glad to know that only 100% of you brushed your teeth. If you Googled how to brush my teeth this morning, just so you know how to do it, sit down. So nobody Googled how to do that. You didn't have to. You may sit down. You didn't have to do that. You learn how to brush your teeth. You do it without thinking. Every now and then you have one of those weird brain things happen where maybe you put shaving cream on your toothbrush, but generally you can do it without thinking, right? So that's great that our brain works that way. We don't have to relearn things. Is that a good thing when we're trying to solve a problem in a new way? No, it gets in the way. So part of our job as facilitators, or as we say, instigators, is to get people to break some of those synaptic connections and consider to start solving from a new place. How do I start solving from somewhere different rather than where I usually begin? So that's biology. When you're meeting resistance, as you're trying to depart from the predictable path and get on the bold path, when you're meeting friction and resistance, it's easy for us to think about that as an antagonistic relationship. I'm the protagonist trying to lead change. There's an antagonist trying to stop me from making that happen. We have to step back and let go and say, you know what? Part of it's just biology. It's part of how our brains work. And people aren't doing that to us on purpose. It's how our brains function. We're actually competing against a whole bunch of neural pathways that have started to track the way problems are solved. The next thing that gets in our way is this. I'm going to ask for you, what do you see when you see this picture? Shout it out. Kids? Peace sign? Friends? Innocence. Give me some other adjectives. Cuteness, happy. Chilly. Cold. Oh, yeah, because they're wearing clothes. Nice, okay. So some people, when they see this picture, think terrorists. These are Syrian refugees, Syrian immigrants. So there's a cultural response to these kids, an unknowing cultural response to these are kids, Syrian refugees. So this morning when the immigrants were asked to stand up, I wanted to get up and clap as a celebration of what an immigrant means and what an immigrant brings to us. But you understand that, an issue like immigration can be polarizing. In America, in the American context right now, we have camps. Pro-immigration, anti-immigration. So that's a cultural response. So again, when we're trying to depart from the predictable path and forge a bold path, we're not only dealing with an issue of how our brain functions, but we're also dealing with the issue of how a whole bunch of brains that function that way together start to act. And the thing about culture is most of what makes cultures operate are assumptions and orthodoxies and biases. They're stories that we pass on. They're lore that we pass on. they're not fact bases, right? It's a belief system that we pass on. So I said it's great that our brain works the way it does. It does. We don't have to relearn things. It's also great that culture works the way that it does. So cultures that are healthy and productive and working in our favor, they actually work to keep themselves safe. They protect themselves. They defend themselves from threat. The problem is because culture works that way, they can lock in things that are toxic. They can lock in things that are not in our best interest. They can perpetuate bad societal behavior and make it seem normal. I like to ask people when they're looking at that predictable path and bold path line, you can think of different people. I used to use Elon Musk as an example, but he's confusing the story. So with his Twitter account. So I'm going to use Malala instead. And I'm going to introduce this, and I'm going to ask you please to believe me that I'm trying not to introduce this idea with any prejudice. Right? I just wanted to use it for illustrative purposes. Do you guys know who Malala is? Mostly? Okay. So Malala is a young woman in the Middle East who stood up and said that young women, and women of all kinds, have the right to be educated. Right? She did that within the context of her culture. And within the very specific context of her culture, that got her labeled a heretic. Right? So think about it. Predictable path, that's the cultural norm. Malala, bold path, women should be educated. A natural cultural reaction to her was what she's proclaiming is not okay. It's outside of the norm for our culture. Right? It's heretical. So we know what happened to Malala. She's shot in the head. Within the context of her culture, that was an acceptable act. Okay. Now, there was another cultural response to her, which was not the culture she was born into. And that cultural response was, she's heroic, she's brave, she's courageous, and she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize because of her position. Two extreme examples of a cultural response to the same person. So when you think about culture and how it affects our ability to help, lead, facilitate, create change, it's important to understand that we are dealing both with biological forces and cultural forces. People are not trying to sabotage you. We do it without thinking. Right? It's human behavior. It's neurological, it's social. It's how we, as creatures, act. So it's really important that you be able to have that conversation, that you be able to use that framework. So when somebody's engaging you, it's okay to say, are we working on something that's about improving the predictable path? Or are we working on something where we're trying to actually create bold change? And are the conditions and the ways that we're acting coming from what's required to sustain the predictable path? Or are they, in fact, conditions that are going to be conducive to creating that change? Next framework. This space, a fairly simple space, where we're going from what's the problem or the challenge that we're working on, what's the solution, and we're dealing with uncertainty. We start from a place of uncertainty, and we're trying to move towards greater certainty. This is another important framework for having a dialogue with somebody, which is where are we starting from? Where's the problem live that we're dealing with? Up here in this corner where we understand what the problem is and we understand what the solution is, there's a set of what we call think right practices. They're language that you're going to be very familiar with, which is people are going to talk about things like, how do we drive costs out of this? How do we improve productivity? How do we increase our margins? People start to worry about things like ROI. So all of that language is familiar to you, whether you're in a corporation or a nonprofit or a foundation or coming out of the defense space. This is the dominant language that's used to frame how we're going to think about and measure success. And that's fine if you know what the problem is and you know what the solution is. The labels of predictable path and bold path sound a little pejorative. They're not. The people who flew here, you again raise your hands, those who flew here, you wanted predictability. You wanted to get on a plane, have the plane fly, take off, fly, land safely. Number one predictable criteria for air travel is safety. What you didn't want was the pilot coming on and saying, I've got a great idea. You're with me? All right? You are with me. You're in the plane. I'm going to try something today I've never tried. Like, you don't want that. When it comes to the known problem and the known solution, I want you to optimize the heck out of that one. And for air travel, I want you to optimize the heck out of safety. The problem is that set of language and that way of framing things doesn't work when we're in that arena of uncertainty. We're uncertain about the problem. We think we know what the problem is, but we're open to the idea that we're wrong. That we might do something that reveals, in fact, that, hey, our assumption about the problem was actually an observation of a symptom, and there's something else deeper going on here. And we're going to learn that. Our assumption about the solution was incorrect. We did some work last October with NATO, a whole conference on AI. They knew what the solution was. It's AI. I don't care what the problem is. If you're in the military right now, the answer is AI. I don't know. Probably not. I mean, I've tried to use Siri, and it gets me lost. It doesn't recognize what I'm saying. It calls people I don't mean to call. So I'm not really sure I'm willing to pin my hope of freedom in the future on AI just yet. It has a role, but what's the problem we're solving? Are we applying it appropriately? So again, this diagram is a way of entering into a conversation. What kind of problem are we working at? Where does it live? How certain are we about the problem, the nature of the challenge? How certain are we about the solution? And are we able to do something quickly that's going to make us more confident? Not get to the answer, but get to a greater level of certainty. So part of our role, part of what we're doing, is saying, we've got to try different practices. So here you see, increase exploration, generate hypotheses, create option value, embrace experiments, pursue discovery, welcome the unexpected. And the measurement here, instead of return on investment, which you've all been asked, what's the return on investment of having you come in and do blah, blah, blah? If you're dealing with the uncertain, if you're in the 9 squares of this, the 8 squares of this diagram that aren't up in that upper right-hand corner, the honest answer to what's the ROI is, I have no idea. It's too early. There's too many assumptions. We can't tell you. LFI is our response to that. LFI is learning from investment. So rather than what's the return on investment, what's the learning from investment? What do we now know because we did this thing that we didn't know before? And what's the value? How much certainty does that create? Right? So I've just introduced 2 frameworks, which means I'm not going to get to the third, but I'm going to go through it real fast here in the last 40 seconds. So in Think Wrong, we've looked at 6 practices of thinking wrong. The 6 practices actually correspond to a moment in the problem-solving journey where a certain thing, a certain action is going to produce the most value. Are our aspirations clear? Is our inspiration sound? Do we have new, fresh ideas? Have we actually started to model and prototype and bring the idea to life? Are we making small bets to increase certainty rather than blowing our whole budget and putting all of our capital at risk? And finally, are we leaning into the people that we convened and brought in the room and their wisdom and using that to accelerate our progress? So I can share that in more than 40 seconds if you want, but that's what I had. So, all right, thanks you guys.